Hello, hello, hello. Again, before we get started this week, I wanted to remind you that you can participate in a project that I'm working on for this podcast. I'm doing a whole episode on mammals, and I want to hear your story. I want to hear about your mammal. I think mammal is kind of a loose term, it doesn't have to be your biological mammal or just like a mammal figure in your life. I want to hear about them. So, if you have a story you want to share about your mammal or a special memory, please send a voice memo or transcript to mountainlaurelspod@gmail.com and you'll be featured in the season 1 finale. I will hopefully be doing a season 2. But the season 1 finale, be featured in the season 1 finale of this podcast. That's mountainlaurelspod@gmail.com. I have already read so many cool stories and I'm excited to share them. Please send me more. And if you could please send them by May 9th, that would be amazing so I can put that episode together. This week, I had the pleasure of speaking with illustrator and author Denali Sai Nalamalapu. Denali wrote and illustrated the upcoming graphic novel Holler, a graphic memoir of rural resistance, which spotlights the journeys of multiple activists in the year-long struggle and fight against the construction of the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which runs through West Virginia, and maybe soon North Carolina. This was a really recent act of resistance that happened in Appalachia, so I was really excited to talk to Denali about not only their book, but sort of how they got into the movement and also about their experience living in Appalachia. Denali is from Maine, but is an Appalachian transplant. I'm really excited for y'all to hear this week's episode, so let's get to it. Denali, it's really great to be speaking with you today. And this is actually a first for the podcast. So usually we've had people come on and they're sort of talking about one person or like one woman in Appalachian history. And this is kind of cool because you have written and illustrated a graphic novel that's sort of about a whole movement that took place pretty recently in Appalachia. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that is and your graphic novel?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jess. I'm really excited to be here. I am excited to talk about this project for this podcast because it does profile 6 people who were part of the pipeline fight in a similar way to the stories you have on the podcast. And 5 of them are women. And then the 6th person is a non binary person. And then I also narrate the book as a non binary person. And part of why I wanted to do that structure was so that people could get to know these 6 very different people. They're all different ages. They range from a college student to a grandmother of 5 kids. And I wanted them to get to know their lives and their skill sets. Like one of the people is a nurse, one person is an indigenous seed keeper, and one person is a single mom who ended up um, in the Charlottesville white supremacist rally counter protest violence that happened several years back. So I wanted people to be able to connect to their backgrounds and then see how they use those skills to fight the pipeline. And primarily it worked out. And the reality of the pipeline is women and queer people were on the front line. So that's who ended up making up the book.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we see and have seen like throughout every episode I do. It's women putting themselves out there to make change and like lead these progressive movements, even on behalf of men. Like, right, I've done an episode on Lois Scott, who led the Brookside strike in Harlan County, really putting herself out there. So yeah, it's this sort of it really fits in with this theme of just like women and queer people leading movements in all over the nation, but especially in Appalachia. And you mentioned, like it worked out with the pipeline. Mountain Valley Pipeline is what we're talking about for those that might not know. What do you? I feel like some of the movement on that it is moved forward. Or am I incorrect? Or did they? What? Yeah, it's moving forward, right, in Southwest Virginia.
Yeah, so the Mountain Valley Pipeline, for listeners who might not know, is a 303-mile frac gas pipeline. It's 42 inches in diameter. So it's a large diameter, high pressure pipeline, and it goes from the fracking fields in northern West Virginia all the way through West Virginia. There are 3 compressor stations that keep the gas flowing, and into Southwest Virginia, and then down through Pittsylvania County into potentially North Carolina if they're successful with having extensions of the pipeline. And the book touches on this a bit, but there was a 10-year long resistance to fight the pipeline, and ultimately what happened was a very powerful politician, Senator Joe Manchin, made some backroom deals with prominent Democrats and Congresspeople to make the pipeline go forward. So now the pipeline is fully in service throughout the main route, and they're trying to get an extension through called the Southgate Extension, and that's in North Carolina.
So, what sort of brought you to like bubbled this story up for you as something that you felt like you needed to illustrate and write this book about it?
I was working at one of the leading grassroots coalitions that fought the pipeline. This coalition, which is called Power, started when the pipeline was proposed back in 2014, and then has continued on. And I was working in communications for the organization, and I was trying to figure out what are other creative ways we could uplift the pipeline fight. And as an illustrator and a writer, something that came to mind was comics and graphic illustration, because I think with fossil fuel fights, because they impact all of us, there's a huge communications opportunity to reach a lot of people and reach them from different perspectives. So everyone from kids who might learn about kids in Appalachia whose schools could be impacted by the pipeline, to parents who might learn about the impacts on respiratory health and they might have a kid who has asthma, to elder people who might be really afraid of environmental disasters like frac gas pipeline explosions. And so I wanted to create something that was accessible for people from early or like mid readers, maybe young adult readers will say, to people who weren't as comfortable reading no matter what age they were at or were too busy with their lives, but wanted to learn about this fight. And then maybe my hope is that they'll be able to apply things they pull from this book to environmental protection that they want to do at home, because realistically, near everyone, there's some part of the environment that humans have um, put into a situation of crisis and that could use some help protecting.
That's really interesting to me because I feel like one of the biggest sort of things that I wrestle with personally and things that I've heard from other folks is like a lot of times they feel like movement work like this can feel inaccessible to them. And it feels like you're really intentional thinking about that. Like, we have to make this more accessible for people, because I think a lot of people like sometimes just feel like they don't have the time, or they don't realize like how something like a pipeline running through their community is going to affect them or affect their kids or their grandkids. So I think that's a really smart approach to sort of, because pictures can tell us so much. I mean, obviously it's a graphic novel, so, but it's like even just pictures can tell us so much about a story. I think about so many just like images that have throughout history. I did an earlier podcast on Ollie Combs, and like one of the things about Ollie Combs is she has this very famous picture of her being carried away from her own property that they wanted to mine by 4 police officers, right? And when you see that, you know that she was fighting against harm, obviously, of her own land, but also like she was willing to sacrifice a lot for that fight. And there's a lot of people in this story that are sacrificing things for this fight. Is there anyone that, like, any of the characters that sort of bubble up for you of like really showing that act of resistance strongly? Maybe as strong as Ollie Combs. Not that they all aren't, but you know what I mean.
Totally. The person that comes to mind is Becky Crabtree, who has a sheep farm in southern West Virginia and is a science teacher, and saw the pipeline coming through her farm and her land, and decided to take the very courageous tactic of locking herself down to her 1970s Ford Pinto, which in the 70s was her dream car that she bought for herself, and then continued to be beloved by her even when it stopped operating. And so the car was positioned at the pipeline crossing on her land, and she chained herself to the crossing. This grandmother of 5 who has white hair, and you would expect to be in your science classroom, but not surrounded by a bunch of her friends singing to 70s and 80s music while she's chained uh, to a Ford Pinto on her land. And I remember her telling me that at least one of the officers that ultimately arrested her was one of her students. And
Wow.
that's like the contradiction that you live in Appalachia, is that the community is so small, and your lives are so intertwined that sometimes really unexpected things happen. Like in the most courageous act of your life, one of your students is the one pulling you away.
That is so fascinating. Like, not only just that coincidence, but also like I would love to talk to her student and be like, what were you feeling in that moment when you had to arrest your former science teacher? I think I remember seeing her car. Like, that was a huge image during the Mountain Valley Pipeline fight. And didn't it like end up getting painted and stuff? Like, I remember it being like yellow, and I believe there's like a documentary that I've seen that it was featured in, that someone had produced at Appalachian Media Institute. Uh, yeah, I remember that. And that's just really amazing too. Like, just a normal science teacher who sees like and knows that the harmful effects that are going to happen from this pipeline, and is like, I can't just sit and watch this happen. Was it going through her property, or did she just put her car out there in the middle of it and chain herself up?
Yeah, this was going through Becky's sheep farm. I definitely Becky's story is one of the most recognizable ones in the book because it was covered by local and national media. And I love that. And I also wanted to balance recognizable pipeline fighter stories with pipeline fighters who wouldn't have gotten any media coverage or were much quieter people. Like in chapter 1 of the book, Paula Mann is the storyteller, And she is a many generation old West Virginian who is living on her family land and hears about the pipeline coming through the area and decides to learn more about it along with her family, her husband, and her nephew. And then ultimately, she decides to use her photography skills to document the ill planning of the pipeline, including where it would go through certain streams and certain boulders. The Mountain Valley Pipeline is a very poorly planned project. It goes through some of the steepest slopes in the entire country. And many people feel like it was planned without anyone stepping foot on the land, which there is evidence um, to affirm that reality. And so Paula decided to use her camera, which she takes like pet photos and family photos generally, but decided to use her camera to document that poor planning, and ultimately some change in small ways was made because of her documentation. So I wanted to balance the more visual, remembered moments of the pipeline fight with also moments that were quieter because I think as an introvert myself, it can be kind of intense to only see very loud parts of activism portrayed, like protests or speaking to the media or speaking in front of Congress. And I remember thinking when I was younger that I couldn't be an activist because it was for extroverts. But actually, there are so many quiet ways to support resistance. And so I wanted to make sure the book had some examples of that.
Yeah, I think an important thing about for all of us to think about when we're thinking about campaigns we're working on or resistance movements, it takes so many different kinds of people, and the amount of work it takes to just get one person in front of the public and saying things. There's like at least 10 people behind them that are helping them, right? And I think it really does. Often it can feel like it's only one or two people, but that's just something I like to remember myself too, is like, this is a group of people, there are probably one-off chances where it's just one person that's just like, no, this is my fight. But I feel like most fights, especially in this region, it's like a movement. It's a group. And I know you mentioned that you were working communications at an environmental group that was sort of fighting the pipeline, but you're not originally from Appalachia, correct? So how did you find yourself in the region? Was it through that job, or did you like want to move here just on a whim?
So I'm from way up the Appalachian Trail from Maine. And my family is from India. So those are the two places that I grew up really connected to. And then in 2019, I moved to Washington, D.C. And my partner, who I met there, is from Shenandoah Valley. So I ended up spending a lot of time in those mountains, and even in the pandemic, lived in Shenandoah Valley, which is historic Appalachia, though not currently considered part of the Appalachian region. And then after getting the job at this grassroots environmental group, I was spending a lot of time in West Virginia and Southwest Virginia. And I just fell in love with the mountains. Like, I remember the first time I drove up Brush Mountain, which is in Southwest Virginia. I felt this guttural sense that I had to live in these mountains. And that was honestly not very convenient for me because I had a life in Washington, D.C. I've always been more drawn to rural places, but there are upsides of living in a city. Like were very much easier to find than in a place like Maine or in a place like Southwest Virginia to some extent, although remote definitely helps. But I just I had to live here. I feel so called to these mountains. Like even driving down Interstate 81 from Roanoke into Southwest Virginia and on into West Virginia or further into Tennessee or Kentucky. I feel so connected to the mountains, especially not in winter. When it's winter, I definitely experience a little bit of like, I don't know what I'm doing anywhere right now. There are no leaves on the trees,
That's
but
all of us, though, actually.
I spend a lot of time hiking and being outside and being with people who are from here. And so I feel very connected not only to the mountains, but to the plants and to the history and also to the people.
Yeah, I mean, winter here really is like if you can make it through a winter, you're good. You're like
Totally.
you're good. You are truly a survivor. Like this winter, I live in eastern Kentucky, like in a national forest. So we are remote. And we had a snowstorm and our power was out for like 6 days and we just hustled through it like we couldn't drive anywhere. I mean, it takes some skill, but like, yeah, you're doing it.
Yeah, and to have community members checking in on each other and bringing each other things. I mean, it definitely happens outside of rural places, but I feel like the bonds sometimes can get stronger out of that need. And that's something that's really important to me, especially as I feel like I can rely less on governmental institutions. It feels important to have community networks where people are relying on each other.
Yeah, and I know in the book too, like there is someone that is working like with a mutual aid network during this pipeline fight, right?
Yeah, so chapter 5 is about Michael James Duramo, who was a student at the time of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the Mountain Valley Pipeline fight. And MJD grew up in Southwest Virginia and grew up very connected to the mountains, grew up playing on Brush Mountain, and heard about the pipeline fight and knew that they wanted to be part of the resistance. And their mode of being part of the resistance was very connected to social justice and mutual aid networks. And that was such a big part of the Mountain Valley Pipeline fight, especially as manifested in direct action. So I think it was a really important and beautiful part of the story that a young person from here was such a big part of the mutual aid and and frontline resistance to this fight.
Yeah, I mean that goes back to like saying it takes all kinds of people. It takes people with all these different skills, but also it's just so interesting to me. And I know that it's not uniquely Appalachian, but it does feel uniquely Appalachian when I think about mutual aid because it's just something that is so sort of inherent in our communities. Because I, I would argue that Appalachia, specifically Central Appalachia, has never been able to rely on federal sources or the government or anything like, and I think that's deeply ingrained in us, just generationally, right? So it really is like it's this sense that we're bred for fights like this, you know. Um, yeah. So I'm just like I'm riffing, but like that's just anytime I hear about large acts of resistance like that, I feel like it's like yeah, that's Appalachian. That is Appalachian.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think living in this region and being a person of color adds like two layers to that because I definitely noticed that there's a very deep history of mutual aid in Appalachia and of that sort of link with resistance to extractive industry. And also, Black and Brown communities in the global South and here have such a strong history of resistance, including like immigrant communities here and also women in places like India. They're just such strong networks like where my family's from, of how people care for each other and how they show up for each other in hard times. And I do think that's something both parts of the global south and Appalachia share, is this history of extractive industry and of not being able to rely on the government, which sometimes can be bought out by these corporations or by richer people. And so then creating these mutual aid networks that don't usually exist in the same way in like elite pockets of the West or East Coast.
Yeah, I think because, well, I won't get too far into my personal opinions on that, but I think there's a real sense of duty. It's not really duty, it's just the sense of community, of like taking care of each other. You know, I think about I'm very involved in mutual aid in Eastern Kentucky, and I think about like, where did I first hear about COVID-19 from? And no lie, it was like February and mutual aid was already preparing, right? And the federal government wasn't really talking about it. And I think about that a lot because we take care of us. And that is how it is. And that's how it has always been, and probably how it always will be. And I've been thinking about it a lot, given everything, gestures at everything. And it's not these one-off thoughts like with Mountain Valley Pipeline get a lot of publicity, but it does feel like an everyday thing. Like, community is so active, and you have to be active in it to be part of it, And I like how you were talking about like how that relates to the global South, because I've thought about that a little bit too. I've not been able to really like travel to those areas, but just hearing stories about how people communicate and like take care of each other and check up on each other, it just feels like home to me in a big way. Did you feel that a little bit when you came here, maybe, and like got to know people and got into more like networks?
Yeah, I connect very strongly with different iterations of marginalization because I have experience having my parents being immigrants and having brown skin and being queer. Um, and I think also because it's like beautiful and strong despite the odds, which I don't mean as a way to like beautify like failing structures. Like there are definitely clear answers that we need addressed and that we do address on the scale of local communities, but seem to fly past many national politicians. Uh, but there is such beauty and strength in rural spaces. And in particular in Appalachia, I found that people were more welcoming than I had experienced before. I grew up in Maine and I was never considered a Mainer because I hadn't been there for 3 generations, which I know exists in some pockets of this region and many other regions. But I felt very isolated growing up, in part because wealthy Southern Mainers have a certain like New England air about them and New England way of being racist, which can be very cold and isolating. But coming to Appalachia, I found that people were more upfront and more welcoming, which was just my experience, but it really made me feel connected to this place. And like the mountains almost had a face in terms of the
Mm.
human representation in the communities I interacted with. And these were communities all over Central Appalachia. Like the Mountain Valley Pipeline is so long that I was engaging with a lot of different kinds of people, a lot of different ages of people. But I just really felt like this was the place that I wanted to be. And it helps that my partner is like his family goes back in Southwest Virginia, and we had spent time in the Shenandoah Valley. So there were some connections there too, but also I don't think that I would feel as connected to this place without the welcoming nature of the people I encountered here.
Yeah. That makes me really happy to hear too, just as like a native of like I don't know how many so many people have traced back their generations. I don't have time to do that, but like, my family's been here in the region for a long time and like has a little family land and like I call it a commune. They would never call it that, but it's like all my family's living on a commune low key. It makes me really happy to hear because I think that there is this belief that, and that's not to say that it's not true to some extent, but that this is like deeply red Trump country. And if you are different, whatever different is, I feel like that has so many, like, it could be interpreted in so many different ways. But like, if you're different, don't come here, you know? And it's been a real fear of mine, like that people will believe that and people will experience that too. And I know people definitely have, different marginalized groups have, but I've also seen like how people have, stood up to that sort of thing too. So it really, really makes me happy to feel like, or that you feel like, this is still a welcoming place.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting because I feel like with the skin color I have and the gender identity I have, a lot of places are complicated to be in, but cities aren't any better. There's this like conception that if you go to New York or LA, you can be who you are. But I don't think that's true. For me, urban cultures can have an element that feels suffocating for me around like you have to think a certain way or talk a certain way. Whereas one of my favorite parts about living here is that I find people who I align with who and we can grow together and like share different experiences we've had together, and we don't have to use the perfect terms for that. We can learn from each other, and we can also just like kind of get down to the essence of conversations, whereas I feel like in some cities or some urban cultures there's sometimes a beating around the bush of, okay, we're using all of the right terms, but what are we actually talking about?
Yes.
That's been important to me.
I think that exists in like even movement spaces more broadly too, right? To a detriment of what we're doing, for sure. Like sometimes not everyone has the right terminology, but they still want to be part of the fight or they still believe or like can be moved, right? And a lot of people are written off. I think too many people are written off because they're not saying the right thing. I also wanted to, there was something you said too about like, it's no better in cities. And first of all, I'm not happy to hear that, but I'm like, that's been my hypothesis for years. I'm like, just because you're in the north or wherever, or just because you're more urbanized or think you're more like modernized, doesn't mean that I think there's sort of like this perception like these places aren't racist or sexist or homophobic. And it's like, that's not true. That is like so deeply untrue. It's and I've experienced here, I think, because I've lived in cities before. I've lived in Denver, Nashville, St. Louis. I think here people, though I don't know if all listeners will believe this or not, right? But it's just like people are more open to having conversations because we are an isolated place. And I think that lends us more towards like these are the people that you live with. And people want to, I think people like at their core want to get along, right? With their neighbor because there's just like that isolating element of this place. So I've always found that people, no matter what age, are a little more open to having conversations that you might not have in a larger city, because in a larger city, it's like, well, I don't ever have to see that person again. So if I don't like them, who cares?
Yeah, that's part of why I wanted the book to have such an intergenerational aspect of people from college age into being elderly, because the reality is that people like change the scope of their life at all different times. None of these people were born into pipeline resistance. They all found their way there. And I think that's really important that we don't give up on people just because they look a way that we think doesn't look like an activist or talk a way that doesn't talk like an activist. There's just so much room and we need everyone. So I think that in certain cities, I've noticed more of a tendency to give up on each other, as you said, because in some ways, there are a lot of people, so you can just find someone else to like do something with. But here, the need to get to know and grow with people, I think, is really the answer to a lot of our problems. And that's part of why I wanted a book like this to exist, because the climate movement and social justice movements in general won't win without Appalachia. There's just like, there's no way, especially the climate movement. Like, there just is no winning without learning from the region that's been the most extracted from in the United States and has consistently resisted that extraction. And yet there is a propensity amongst coastal elites to completely write off Appalachia. Like the other day, someone said to me, "It's too bad there's nothing in West Virginia." And I was like, it's too bad you don't see the most beautiful state in the United States is West Virginia. Like it just, people have some wild beliefs about Appalachia that really make me sad for them. And so I hope that for some people who have written off this region, they can have their minds opened a bit by this book and by so many other books coming out of the region that are talking about Appalachian stories and history, and then they can start like building that better future with people in the region, not like in spite of people in the region.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. Um, the word that is coming to mind for me is like grace. And I think a lot of people in this region have grace.
Mm,
And I think grace can, I mean, I'm a Christian, so I'm like, grace is a word that comes to my mind a lot. But I think grace is something that, one of the best gifts that you can give someone. It makes my heart feel good because I feel like I'm in a place where a lot of people are able to offer grace to others. And it's interesting because also at the same time, I don't think this is a region that has been offered much grace from like the nation. I'm really excited to read your book. Um, do you, well, first of all, is there anything like else you want to say before we close out, like that maybe I didn't get to or you want to mention?
The one thing that I didn't mention is the closing chapter of the book features Desiree Shelley Flores, who is an indigenous seed keeper. Desiree is part Monacan and part Polish and grew up in Baltimore and then felt called to be to the land her ancestors lived on. And I wanted Desiree's chapter to close the book, in part because Desiree strongly identifies as the mother of three and as a seed keeper who's trying to bring indigenous languages and seeds into the future, both with her kids and as an individual. And I feel that's a very important act of collective care that many people don't know about, seek knowledge about, have interaction with, both in the region and outside of the region. It's an awful thing to have a pipeline go over your land, and it's an awful thing to have colonizers displace you from your land or kill your loved ones and kill your loved ones. So that also feels important as part of this book as well, as all of the other stories, just that there are different ways to relate to this land and to protect it.
Yeah. Thank you. Like I said, I'm really excited to get your book. It comes out May 11th. Is that right?
It comes out May 13th.
May 13th. Sorry. May 13th. But you can pre-order it now.
Yeah, you can get the book anywhere books are sold, including at bookshop.org, where you can get it and give money to your local bookstore.
I highly recommend bookshop.org. Like if I can't find it, like if I want to buy it and I can't find it at my local bookstore, bookshop.org is definitely the place to hit up. Well, thank you again. I'm so glad to have talked to you and to have met you too. Like this is the cool thing about this podcast, right? It's like I get to like talk to people and meet people that I would not have otherwise. So yeah, it's like, you know, anyone that sort of lives in the region, I feel like is like a cousin or something, like, you know what I mean? So like, I feel like a connection now to also anyone on this podcast. I'm like, anytime we talk, I'm like, we're connected now for life. It's recorded. Yeah. So it's really great to meet you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jess.
Holler will be out May 13th, but as mentioned, you can pre-order it now anywhere books are sold. Again, I recommend bookshop.org and go on there and support your local bookstore. Thank you for listening again this week. This podcast is produced and edited by me, Jessica Miles. This week, our artwork was by Denali Sai Nalamalapu. Our theme music is produced by Kenny and Hayden Miles. If you'd like to support the show, you can find me on Patreon at patreon.com/Mountain Laurels Podcast. You can also follow the show on Instagram and Blue Sky. I'll be back next week.